Story 1. Isolation and desolation. I've always prided myself on my logical mind. As a geologist with a decade of experience, I've spent most of my life in harsh, isolated conditions. But nothing prepared me for what we found or didn't find at Outpost Vega. It was mid-January, deep into the Arctic winter, and our team had been flown in to relieve the previous researchers at the remote station. The weather was brutal, with wind that screamed like a banshee and snow, so thick it felt like the earth was erasing itself. We were expecting to find a tired but eager crew, ready to return home after 6 months of solitude. The place looked intact, fully operational, but lifeless. The bright orange exterior of the station, we found it unlocked. That was unusual, but not alarming yet. We stepped inside, calling out names. Dr. Holcomb, Dr. Laird. Our voices echoed down the metal corridors, swallowed by an oppressive stillness. The air was warm, the lights were on, and the equipment hummed softly, as if everything was running perfectly. But there were no coats on the hooks, no boots by the door. The station looked like it had been abandoned in the middle of the day. Plates of half-eaten food sat on the dining table, now frozen solid. A steaming pot of coffee had tipped over, its contents staining the floor. It was as if everyone had just vanished. We split up to check the station thoroughly, hoping to find anyone. Claire headed toward the lab, while I and the others checked the living quarters. The hallways were narrow and cold, even with the heaters running, and the hum of the generators seemed louder than it should have been, like they were straining against something unseen. Each room we opened told the same story. Beds unmade, personal belongings scattered, but no signs of struggle. One room still had an alarm clock blaring faintly, its battery slowly dying. It was unsettling, like walking through a frozen snapshot of someone else's life. In the lab, Claire found the first sign that something was seriously wrong. The computers were still logged in under the names of the previous researchers, their work pulled up on the screens. But the notes, they didn't make sense. Scribbled across open notebooks and sticky notes were fragments of sentences. "It's watching. Don't go outside. We shouldn't have listened." Some pages were torn, others smudged with what looked like dried blood. Claire's voice trembled as she read aloud one particularly chilling line. "The snow speaks when the wind dies." None of us knew what to make of it. The strangest discovery was in the storage room. On the far wall, someone had scrawled a crude map of the station and its surroundings. Red X's marked certain areas outside, and next to them were more warnings. "No return. Silent zone. Do not dig." The handwriting was frantic, almost illegible. Whatever had happened here, the researchers had been desperate to document it right before they disappeared. The eerie quiet of the place seemed to press in on us as we stared at that map, each of us wondering the same thing. Had they all gone insane? As night fell, we decided to stay together in the common room. None of us said it, but the thought of sleeping alone was unbearable. Claire tried the radio, but all we got was static. Our satellite phones were no better. It was as if the station was cut off from the rest of the world. We decided to ration the food and fuel we found, just in case rescue didn't come soon. Still, none of us could shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every creak of the station felt louder, every shadow longer. It was around midnight when we first heard it. A faint scratching sound, like claws against metal. It came from somewhere outside, but every time we looked, there was nothing there, just the howling wind and endless snow. The sound would stop for a while, only to return louder, closer. Claire suggested it might be the wind or an animal, but I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe it. None of us did. The next morning, we ventured outside to check the surrounding area. The snow was pristine, untouched, no tracks, no sign of life. But near the back of the station, we found something chilling. A series of deep, parallel grooves carved into the ice, as if by massive claws. The marks led away from the station and disappeared into the blinding white horizon. I felt my stomach churn as I stared at them, a primal part of me screaming to get away. We returned to the station, more unsettled than ever. Whatever had made those marks wasn't something we were prepared to deal with. But leaving wasn't an option. The helicopter wasn't due back for another 3 days, and the storm had only gotten worse. We tried to keep busy, focusing on cataloging the researchers' belongings and organizing what little data we could find. But by evening, The scratching returned this time from inside the walls. The scratching inside the walls grew louder as the evening wore on, rhythmic and deliberate, like something pacing just out of sight. At one point, Claire pressed her ear to the wall, her face pale as snow. "It's moving," she whispered. Her words sent a shiver through all of us. How could something be inside the walls? The station was built on a thick foundation of metal and reinforced panels. There was no space for anything to hide, and yet, the sound persisted, growing bolder, almost taunting us. By the second night, the sound was accompanied by a faint clicking noise, like teeth chattering. Claire suggested sealing off the room where it was loudest. But as soon as we tried to block the door, the noises seemed to spread, echoing through the entire station. It felt as if the walls were alive, pulsating with something unnatural. None of us slept that night. Every flicker of light, every shift of shadow, made our hearts race. We stayed huddled together, clutching whatever tools we could find as makeshift weapons. On the third day, the temperature inside the station began to drop, despite the heaters running full blast. Frost crept along the walls, and our breath hung in the air. I remember glancing at the thermostat and seeing it plummet -30, -40, until the display froze entirely. Then came the smell, a metallic, acrid stench that stung the back of our throats. It was faint at first, but soon it was everywhere, saturating the air like a warning. Around midday, we heard something new. Voices. They were faint, barely audible over the hum of the station, but unmistakable. They echoed down the corridors, speaking in a language none of us could understand. It sounded like whispers carried on the wind, but the words were too sharp, too deliberate. Claire swore she heard her name. I thought I heard mine too, but I didn't dare say it out loud. We were unraveling, each of us on the brink of panic, yet too afraid to acknowledge it. That night, we made a decision. We couldn't wait for rescue. The storm had cleared enough for us to try hiking back to the helicopter's drop-off point, even if it meant risking frostbite or worse. We packed what we could carry, leaving behind the haunting remnants of the previous team. But as we reached the station's exit, the scratching and clicking grew deafening, vibrating through the walls. The lights flickered, and for the first time, we heard a low, guttural growl sound that didn't belong to anything human. We bolted into the night, the Arctic wind cutting through us like knives. The station loomed behind us, its orange walls barely visible through the swirling snow. But even as we ran, we could still hear the noises, scratching, clicking, growling following us, chasing us. When we finally reached the drop-off point, our satellite phones lit up with reception, as if the station itself had been the source of the interference. We called for an emergency extraction and huddled together, shaking with cold and fear, until the helicopter arrived. To this day, I can't explain what we experienced at Outpost Vega. The official report called it a case of mass hysteria, exacerbated by extreme isolation. But I know what we heard, what we felt. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up to the sound of scratching, faint and distant, as if it's still out there, waiting. And I can't help but wonder, if we had stayed one more night, would we have vanished too? Story 2. Desperate decision. I wasn't always like this, jumpy, paranoid, questioning every shadow. A few years ago, I would have laughed at the idea of being scared of an empty room. Back then, I was living in Anchorage, working as a meteorologist. It was a solitary life, but I liked it that way. When I got the assignment to join a remote research station in the Arctic, I was thrilled. It was supposed to be 3 months of pure focused data collection, observations, and honestly, a break from the noise of the world. But whatever I thought I'd find, there was nothing compared to what found me. The station was small, barely big enough for 2 people, but I didn't mind. It had all the essentials: food, heat, communication systems. The only other person stationed there was Dr. Meyer, a seasoned glaciologist with a no-nonsense attitude. We worked well together, splitting our tasks and barely speaking except during mealtimes. It was a rhythm I found comforting. But about 6 weeks in, things started to unravel. It began subtly. Misplaced tool, a door left open that neither of us remembered touching. Meyer shrugged it off, but I couldn't. It felt wrong. One night, the first real storm of the season rolled in. The wind howled so fiercely it felt like the station itself would be ripped from the ground. I was in the control room, monitoring the equipment, when I heard something faint tapping on the door. At first I thought it was the wind throwing loose snow against the metal. But then it happened again, louder, deliberate. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice shaking despite myself. No answer. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but when Meyer burst into the room, pale as a sheet, I knew it wasn't just me. Meyer was shaking as he closed the door behind him. "Did you hear it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my pulse pounding in my ears. He didn't wait for my response before continuing. "It's not the wind I saw. Something moving out there." My stomach churned. Meyer wasn't the type to joke or exaggerate. If he said he saw something, then he saw something. But what could possibly be out here, miles from any other human being? The nearest base was hundreds of miles away, and no wildlife would knock on a door. We decided to check the cameras. The station had 4 external feeds, all aimed at different angles of the surrounding tundra. The storm made visibility almost zero, but we could just make out the silhouette of the station, its bright lights cutting through the swirling snow. At first, we saw nothing unusual, just the endless white of the Arctic night. But then, on the feed, facing the west side, something flickered. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. A shadow darting, just outside the light's edge. Meyer froze, his hand gripping the desk so hard his knuckles turned white. "It's circling," he whispered. I wanted to deny it, to find some logical explanation, but my mouth was dry. We watched in silence as the shadow reappeared on another feed, closer this time. It moved unnaturally, almost like it was gliding over the snow. And then it stopped, right at the edge of the camera's view. For a moment, nothing happened. The screen flickered with static, and when it cleared, the shadow was gone. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my spine as Meyer muttered, "We need to stay inside." The next day, the storm had died down, but neither of us dared leave the station. Meyer suggested bolting the doors and windows, as if that would keep out whatever was out there. I spent hours at the monitors, scanning the cameras, but the shadow didn't return. By evening, the tension in the air was suffocating. We barely spoke, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I tried to focus on my work, but every small noise made me jump. The hum of the heaters, the creak of the floret, all felt sinister now, like the station itself was turning against us. That night, the knocking came back. It was louder this time, more insistent. Meyer grabbed a wrench and stood by the door, his face pale but determined. "If it wants in, it's not getting past me," he said through gritted teeth. I admired his resolve, but I couldn't shake the feeling that opening that door would be a mistake. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate, as if whatever was outside knew we were listening. "Maybe it's someone in trouble," I whispered, though I didn't believe it. Meyer shook his head. "No one survives out there in this cold. No one human, anyway." By the third night, the knocking turned into pounding. It echoed through the station, reverberating in our chests. Meyer and I took turns watching the door, sleep becoming an impossible luxury. On the fourth night, the pounding stopped, but the silence was worse. I found myself straining to hear something. Anything but the air was dead. Meyer's nerves finally broke. He insisted we confront whatever was out there, claiming it was better than waiting to be driven mad. I tried to stop him, but he was already pulling on his coat, wrench in hand. I followed him to the door, heart hammering. Meyer opened it slowly, the metal creaking as if protesting the decision. For a moment, there was nothing but the cold wind and the vast emptiness of the Arctic wilderness. But then, I saw just a glimpse, a flicker of movement in the distance. A shape, tall and impossibly thin, standing against the horizon. Meyer didn't hesitate. He stepped outside, shouting into the void, demanding answers. I stayed frozen in the doorway, unable to move as the wind swallowed his voice. I should have stopped him. I should have grabbed his arm and pulled him back inside. But instead, I stood there, paralyzed. As Meyer trudged further into the snow, he shouted again, his voice strained with anger and fear. The figure didn't move it, just stood there, its outline shimmering in the distance like heat waves on asphalt. Then, without warning, It began to glide toward him. Not walking, gliding smooth and unnerving, like it wasn't touching the ground. Meyer stopped dead in his tracks, the wrench slipping from his grip. "What? What is that?" he stammered. The figure moved closer, and for the first time, I saw its face or a lack of one. Its head was featureless, pale and smooth like polished bone. Long, spindly limbs stretched unnaturally, bending in ways that defied logic. My stomach churned, and I felt the bile rise in my throat. Meyer screamed, a sound I'll never forget, raw and primal. I turned to run, but he slipped on the ice, landing hard. I wanted to help him, to do something, but my legs felt like lead. All I could do was watch. The figure didn't attack. It just stood over him, its head tilting slowly, almost curiously. Meyer scrambled backward, clawing at the snow, his eyes wide with terror. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking. The figure paused, as if considering his words. Then, in a single, horrifying motion, it reached down and grabbed him by the arm. Meyer's scream cut through the icy air as the figure lifted him effortlessly, its long fingers curling around him like a spider wrapping prey. And then, they were swallowed by the blinding white of the Arctic. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring at the empty horizon. The cold gnawed at my skin, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Finally, I stumbled back into the station and locked the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the latch. The silence inside was deafening, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. Meyer was gone. There was no one left but me. And that's when I realized the knocking hadn't stopped, had just moved. It was coming from the ceiling now, faint but steady. My eyes darted to the vents, the walls, the floor, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the relentless sound, mocking me. I wanted to run, to scream, but there was nowhere to go. The station was a coffin, and I was trapped inside it. I thought about calling for help, but what could I say? That something had taken Meyer, that I was being hunted by a creature that defied all logic. No one would believe me. By the 5th day, I'd stopped eating, stopped sleeping. The knocking had spread to every part of the station, a constant, maddening reminder that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing Meyer's voice, faint and distorted, calling my name from somewhere deep within the station. But I knew it wasn't him. It couldn't be. Whatever was out there had followed me in, and it was playing with me, wearing me down. I knew I couldn't last much longer. That's when I made the decision. I walked to the door, the cold seeping through the metal, and placed my hand on the latch. I didn't know what I'd find outside, freedom, death, or something worse, but I couldn't stay here. With a deep breath, I threw the door open and stepped into the blinding Arctic wilderness. The wind whipped around me, and for a moment, I thought I saw the figure again, standing on the horizon, waiting. And then, everything went white. Story 3, The Fog's Return. I grew up in Seabrook, a tiny coastal town that most people only know exists because of the lighthouse. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where secrets are rare, and life moves at the pace of the tides. I'd moved away years ago, chasing bigger dreams in a bigger city. But when my dad passed last summer, I found myself back here, living in the house I grew up in. It was supposed to be temporary, a few months, to sort out the estate and figure out my next steps. But then the fog came, and everything changed. At first, it was just a typical morning mist, rolling in off the ocean like it always did. The locals barely noticed it. Fishermen still headed out at dawn, their boats disappearing into the haze, and kids played on the beach like nothing was wrong. But by the second day, the fog hadn't lifted. It clung to the town like a second skin, damp and heavy, muffling sounds and distorting shapes. I remember standing on my porch, staring out at the street, and feeling like I was looking at a ghost town. Everything seemed off. By the third day, people started to notice. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe. Cars wouldn't start, phones lost signal, and even the power flickered unpredictably. It wasn't just the fog, it was what came with it. Strange sounds echoed through the streets at night, low, guttural growls and faint whispers, like the town itself was talking. My neighbor, old Mr. Harmon, swore he saw someone standing in his yard, a tall figure shrouded in mist, but when he called out, it vanished. We all laughed nervously, but deep down, none of us were laughing. On the 5th day, the fog was no longer just an inconvenience, it was a presence. The entire town felt its weight. The once lively streets were empty, shops closed, and even the seagulls had disappeared. At night, the growls grew louder, and the whispers turned into unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from all directions. I started keeping my windows locked and my lights off, hoping to make myself invisible. The air smelled strange, now as sharp. Metallic temps that reminded me of rusting iron. It clung to everything, seeping into clothes, walls, even skin. That evening, I heard the first disappearance. The Thompsons, a family that lived 2 streets over, had ventured out into the fog to check on a relative. They never returned. Their car was found abandoned on the edge of town, headlights still on, doors wide open. No footprints, no signs of us. Gone. Sheriff Mills tried to organize a search party, but no one wanted to leave their homes. "It's just a bad storm," he said, but his voice betrayed his fear. He didn't believe his own words, and neither did we. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my door. It was written in shaky, uneven handwriting, the ink smudged, like the writer had been in a hurry. It read, "Don't leave, don't look, it's watching." I stared at those words for what felt like hours, my hands trembling. Who had written it, and what did they mean by it? I wanted to crumple the note and forget it ever existed, but I couldn't. I folded it neatly and tucked it into my jacket pocket, as if keeping it close might offer some protection. By the 7th day, the town was barely functioning. People whispered about the fog as if it were alive, some kind of sentient thing that fed on fear. Those who ventured into it either disappeared completely or returned, changed. One of them was Sarah, a teenager who lived down the street. She'd gone out to find her dog and stumbled back hours later, shivering and soaked to the bone. When her mother asked what happened, Sarah just kept repeating, "It's watching, it's watching." Over and over again, her voice flat and hollow. I tried to keep myself busy, but the isolation was suffocating. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, and the silence was unbearable. Every creak of the house made my heart race, and the whispers in the fog seemed to grow louder. Sometimes I thought I saw shapes moving outside, thin figures that vanished the moment I looked directly at them. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was standing over me, watching, waiting. That night, I heard footsteps outside my house. They were slow, deliberate, circling the property. I held my breath, clutching the kitchen knife I'd started carrying everywhere. The footsteps stopped at the front door, and I heard a soft knock once, twice, 3 times. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. The knocking continued, steady and patient, as if it knew I was inside. "Go away," I finally shouted, my voice cracking. The knocking stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. When I finally worked up the courage to check the door, there was no one there. Just the thick, oppressive fog, swirling lazily in the faint porch light. But as I stepped back inside, I noticed something new, a faint handprint on the glass, too large to belong to any person. I locked the door and turned off the lights, retreating to the farthest corner of the house. I stayed there all night, listening to the whispers and watching the fog, praying for morning to come. By the 10th day, the town was unrecognizable. The fog had consumed everything, stretching inland like a greedy hand. People stopped leaving their homes entirely, barricading windows and doors, as if that would help. I hadn't seen another person in days, but I knew they were still there, silent, waiting, just like me. The whispers in the fog had grown louder, clearer. They weren't random anymore. They called my name now, soft and insistent, pulling at the edges of my sanity. I tried covering my ears, blasting music, anything to drown them out, but nothing worked. The next night, the power went out completely. The darkness was suffocating, the only light coming from the pale glow of the fog outside. I lit every candle I could find, their flickering flames casting long, jittery shadows that made the house feel alive. As I sat there, trying to keep my breathing steady, I heard it again, footsteps. They were heavier this time, deliberate, as if whatever was out there was no longer trying to hide. I gripped the knife in my lap, my knuckles white. This time, the The footsteps didn't stop at the door. They went around the house, circling, closer and closer. I was too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic chorus that filled the room. They weren't just outside anymore. They were inside, all around me. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it all to stop. But then I heard it, a deep, guttural voice, distinct from the rest, speaking just one word. Come. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the corner of the room. Tall and shadowy, its form flickering like smoke. I don't know what possessed me, but I ran. I threw open the back door and plunged into the fog, the icy air burning my lungs. The whispers followed me, growing louder with every step. The world around me disappeared, swallowed by the fog, until it was just me and the voices. They spoke in unison now, chanting my name like a mantra. I couldn't tell if I was running towards something or away from it. All I knew was that I couldn't stop. When I finally collapsed, the fog began to shift. Shapes emerged around me, tall, thin figures with elongated limbs and featureless faces. They moved with unnatural grace, circling me like predators, sizing up their prey. One of them stepped forward, and for a moment, I thought it was reaching for me. But then it stopped, tilting its head as if studying me. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a heavy, oppressive stillness. And then, just like that, the figures melted back into the fog. I woke up on the edge of town, lying in the damp grass. The fog had retreated, leaving the air eerily clear. My house, the streets, everything was exactly as it had been before the fog came, except for one thing. The town was empty. Every home, every building, was abandoned, as if the people had vanished into thin air. I walked through the streets, calling out, but no one answered. The silence was deafening, the town a hollow shell of what it once was. To this day, I don't know why the fog spared me. I moved away, far from the coast, but I can't escape it. Some nights I wake up to the sound of whispers, faint and distant, as if the fog is calling me back. And sometimes, when I look out the window, I think I see the mist, curling at the edges of the horizon, waiting for me to return. Thank you for joining us for these chilling tales of isolation, desperation, and the unknown. Each story reminds us of how fragile our understanding of reality truly is, and how terrifying it can be when that reality unravels. Did you catch the hidden clues scattered throughout the stories? If you noticed the Easter egg, let us know in the comments. The first to uncover it will get a shout out in our next video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another spine-tingling story. And if you enjoyed these tales, share them with someone who loves a good scare. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.